Welcome to episode 6 of my Black Plague painting series. This time we're going to be painting Black Currant from the special guest box by Carl Critchlow. I'm going to start off in the usual way by first washing the miniature and then priming it. This time I'm going to be using Army Painter's Uniform Grey. First thing I'm going to do is paint all the hardest to reach places, starting with the two heads hanging from Black Currant's belt. These look like mummified zombie heads, so for this I'm going to be using Army Painter's Necrotic Flesh. Next, I'm going to use Citadel's Skavenblight Dinge to paint the wolf pelt on Black Currant's back. Black Currant has a few areas that are not covered by armor, and cloth is exposed. I'm going to paint these with Skavenblight Dinge as well, starting at the waist and then moving on to the armpits. For the armor, I'm going to be using Army Painter's Gunmetal. The artist's concept shows a much darker finish, and if you want to more accurately portray this, you could use P3's Pig Iron. I would recommend against painting his armor completely black, however, because you would not be able to see any of the shading effects we're going to apply later. Next, I'm going to use a slightly darker color to paint the shoulder pads, and for this I've decided to mix some dead black with the gunmetal. By doing this, I'm going to create a color that is virtually identical to pig iron. I'm also going to be using this color to paint the inner part of the crossguard of his sword. For the trim around his shoulder plates and his face guard, I'm going to be using Gehenna's Gold. Next, I'm going to be using Steel Legion Drab by Citadel. I'm going to start by first painting the sole of Black Currant's boot, and then I'm going to move on to the vulture. I'm going to paint the entire body with this color, and I'm also going to paint the top half of the vulture's wings. I'm going to use the same color to paint the hair on one of the zombie heads hanging from his belt, and then I'm going to use it to paint the strap going across his chest. For the horns attached to Black Currant's helmet, I've decided to use Citadel's Screaming Skull. For Blackcurrant's belt, I've decided to use Army Painter's Wasted Jeans. Next, I'm going to use Army Painter's Zombie Skin to paint the hair of the second zombie head. For the sword hilt and blade, I've decided to go with a really bright silver, in this case Army Painter's Shining Silver. I'm also going to be using the Shining Silver to paint the scale mail that's hanging from Blackcurrant's belt. For the cloak, I've decided to go with a deep purple. I'm going to be using Citadel's Naggaroth Night. Next, I'm going to be painting the lower portion of the vulture's wings, and for this I'm going to be using Ushabti Bone. For the head and neck of the vulture, I'm going to be using Army Painter's Barbarian Flesh. I'm also going to be using this color to paint the talons of the vulture. And finally, I'm going to be painting a tuft of white feathers just under the neck of the vulture. Blackcurrant's scabbard, I've decided to go with Vallejo's Heavy Grey. And despite its name, the color is more like a green than a grey. Next, I'm going to go back to Gehenna's Gold, and with this I'm going to paint all around the gems on Blackcurrant's belt. At this point I noticed that there's gold trim around the top of the helmet where the horns connect, so I went back and touched this up as well. For the last of the base colors, I'm going to be using Army Painter's Plate Mail Metal. I'm going to be using this to paint all the metal areas on his sheath. At the top of the sheath, I'm going to be painting it completely with plate mail metal. With all the base colors complete, it's time to start the shading. I'm going to begin with Agrax Earthshade. I'm going to start by shading in the entire vulture, except for his head, and then I'm going to shade in the horns attached to Blackcurrant's helmet. I'm also going to use the Earthshade on the zombie heads hanging from Blackcurrant's belt, and I'm going to use it on the hair of the zombie hanging from Blackcurrant's left side. And finally, I'm going to use the Earthshade on Black Currant's leather sole and on the leather strap that goes across his chest. For Black Currant's armor, I'm going to be using a relatively new shade by Citadel. This one is called Nuln Oil Gloss. Now this shade is virtually identical to the original Nuln Oil, with the one difference that once it dries, it leaves the area shiny. This makes it great for painting over metallic silver colors. So as you can see here, I'm painting all the metallic parts of the miniature, but I'm going to leave the scale mail belt untouched. The next wash I'm going to be using is Seraphim Sepia. I'm first going to use this to give a reddish tint to the hair of the zombie on the right side of his belt. And after that I'm going to wash over all of the areas that we painted with Gehenna's gold. For the head and talons of the vulture, I'm going to be using Reikland Fleshshade. Next I'm going to be using Nuln Oil, and with this I'm going to wash over all the areas we painted with Skavenblight Dinge, starting with the wolf pelt on his back and then moving to his waist and under his arms. For Black Currant's belt, I'm going to be using Drakenhof Nightshade. And at this point I'm being very careful not to hit the areas I've painted with Gehenna's gold. I'm also going to be using the Drakenhof Nightshade to give a blue tint to the scale mail hanging from Black Currant's belt. Next I'm going to wash the entire cloak with Druchii Violet. For the final shade, I'm going to mix equal parts Agrax Earthshade and Biel-tan Green to wash over the sheath for the sword. Now that the shading's done, it's time for the highlights. I'm going to start my highlights with the head of the vulture. I'm going to focus most of my paint on the top of his head and on the sides of his neck. I'm also going to gently retouch the paint on the top of his talons. Next I'm going to be using Citadel's Steel Legion Drab to highlight the top of the vulture's wings. I'm also then going to move on to his back and highlight individual feathers. At this point I have very little paint on my brush. I don't want any of it to spill over and fall into the grooves between the feathers. And the last thing I'm going to do with the Steel Legion Drab is just highlight the raised edges of the strap that goes across his chest. Next I'm going back to the vulture, this time using Karak Stone, and I'm going to highlight individual feathers on the lighter part of his wings. Next I'm going to use some Ceremite White, and I'm just going to lightly dab it on the white feathers just under the vulture's neck. I'm going to put one final touch on the vulture by first painting the tip of his beak black, and I'm also going to use the black to paint his eyes. Now because I used the Glossy Nuln Oil, it's not necessary for me to retouch the plate mail parts of the miniature. I am however going to use Army Painter's plate mail metal to trace around the raised edges of the armor. So I'm focusing my brush mostly on the sharp edges of the armor, but I'm also going to highlight areas like the tops of the elbows, tops of the knees, and any of the rivets that are sticking out. If you painted all of your armor with P3's pig iron, then I would recommend you do your highlighting with gunmetal instead of plate mail metal. Next I'm going to use Army Painter's zombie skin to just retouch the top of the head of the zombie on his right side. The horns attached to Black Currant's helmet are covered in grooves, so for this part I'm going to be doing a dry brush highlight. And for this I'm going to be using Citadel's Screaming Skull. For the wolf pelt on Black Currant's back, I'm also going to be doing a dry brush highlight, and for this I'm going to be using Mechanicus Standard Grey. For the cloak, I'm going to use Naggaroth Night to retouch most of it except for the deepest recesses. And at this point I have my paint mixed with an equal amount of water. Next I'm going to mix in a roughly equal amount of alien purple along with some more water. Now I'm going to add about 3 layers of this paint, and each time I do, the area I cover is going to get smaller and smaller, moving towards the top of the ridges. For my final layer of highlight, I'm going to use a pure alien purple mixed with water. And I'm only using this in a very small area to emphasize the most raised parts of the cloak. Next I want to emphasize the eye slits on Black Currant's mask, so I'm going to be using Army Painter's Pure Red. For the sword sheath, I'm just going to retouch it with Vallejo's Heavy Grey. I'm only retouching the top half of the sheath, and if you wanted to add an extra bit of highlight, you can mix in a small amount of Necrotic Flesh with your Heavy Grey. For the sword's edge and crossguard, I'm going to be using Shining Silver. I'm only using the Shining Silver to repaint the edge of the blade, and I'm also going to trace around the square edges of his crossguard. Next I'm going to paint the gems on Black Currant's belt. For this I'm going to be using one of Citadel's newer technical gemstone paints. I'm going to start off by painting the gemstone area with Stormhost Silver. I'm using this paint completely undiluted because I want to create as reflective a surface as possible. Once I've completely covered the surface of the gemstones, I'm going to let the paint dry completely. Next, I'm moving on to Citadel's Soulstone Blue. According to Games Workshop, in order to use this paint properly, you get a small amount in your brush, start at the bottom of the gem, and then drag the paint upwards. This particular paint is a clear blue gel, and it's not all that different in texture from Army Painter's Quick Shade. A few points of advice when using this particular paint. After you apply the paint, you only have about 10 to 15 seconds before it starts to clump, so you don't want to brush it around too much. Also, after it's applied, you may want to give it 24 hours to dry and avoid touching the gemstone paint. To highlight the belt, I'm first going to retouch all the raised areas with Army Painter's Wasted Jeans. Next, I'm going to use Citadel's Teclis Blue and just put a thin edge of highlight around the rim of the belt. For the scale mail hanging from his belt, I'm going to mix a small amount of our Soulstone Blue into some shining silver. Now this mixture of paint is going to be almost identical to the color already on the scale mail. I'm only using it to touch up the areas that receive too much of the wash. Next, I want to give the appearance that there's a hole in the sheath for the sword, so I'm going to paint a very thin line using Army Painter's Dead Black. For the final highlight, I'm just going to repaint over the most raised areas on the faceplate and on his shoulder pads using a mix of Gehenna's Gold and a small amount of Lamian Medium. I'm also going to use this mixture to retrace around the edges of the gemstones. Now it's time to paint the base. I usually start off with a 2-to-1 mix of Karak Stone to Steel Legion Drab. In a previous video, I used a round cutout to create a stone pattern on the floor, and I'm going to be reusing that same thing again now. Next, I'm going to create random flagstone patterns on the floor using Skavenblight Dinge. Once my stone pattern is done, I'm going to color in random stones using Army Painter's Leather Brown, Brainmatter Beige, and Zombie Skin. Next, I'm going to paint all the way around the edge of the base using Citadel's Dryad Bark. My final step for a hero miniature is typically to paint around the base using Army Painter Quick Shade, but if you didn't want to do this, you could also use a layer of Agrax Earthshade. Once the miniature is completely dried, I'm going to give it a couple layers of thin varnish. This time I'm going to be using Army Painter's Aegis Suit, which is a satin varnish. If you don't have this varnish, then I would definitely recommend using Army Painter's matte varnish. I have a small bottle of the matte varnish, and I'm going to be using this to paint the cloak and the base. Finally, I'm going to be using Citadel's Ardcoat, which is a glossy varnish, just to paint over the gems to give them back their shine. And here is our finished miniature. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you very much for watching.